A peculiar situation is currently taking place within the politics of the United Kingdom. When we look at the heads of the executive branches of government in the countries comprising the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom as a whole, none of them is ethnically British. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is Rishi Sunak, of Indian descent. The First Minister of Wales is Vaughan Getting, son of white Welshman and black Zambian woman. The First Minister of Scotland is Humza Yousaf, the son of first-generation Pakistani Punjabi Muslim immigrants to the UK. The First Minister of Northern Ireland is Michelle O'Neill, a woman of Catholic Irish Republican background. The Mayor of London, the undisputed economic nerve centre of the United Kingdom and one of the world economy's apex cities, is also of Pakistani descent. That is quite something. When it comes to somehow interpreting this reality, one can go many different ways. If one is some kind of white ethno-nationalist, a position that many people repeatedly prescribe me of belonging to, even though it is not the case, he could interpret it as a definitive proof of the continuous encroachment of non-Western immigration onto the power structures of his country. If one is a woke activist working in an NGO, he might conclude that his job is done. The positions of power are no longer withheld from the members of ethnic or religious minorities, as well as from women. So, the NGO can be dismembered and all the employees can find proper jobs. Yeah. Sure. And if you are a Northern Ireland Protestant Unionist, then it is just a bloody catastrophe. However, it is also a fascinating study of how different origins of immigrants propel different political leanings. While Brits of Indian origin, but especially those whose ancestors were members of the Indian communities in British African colonies, like Rishi Sunak or Suella Braverman, tend to prefer the Conservative Party. Brits of Pakistani descent tend to be politically active on the progressive left, as is the case with Sadiq Khan or Humza Yousaf. The UK situation in terms of demographics is anything but simplistic. There is likely no other European country where people of various immigration origins would have achieved such a level of societal prominence, as can be illustrated in the aforementioned political positions achieved by them. Whatever one might think about each of the specific politicians, those people are undeniably completely socially integrated. If a politician of Pakistani descent is trying to enact some of the most radical pro-transgender laws out there, you know they are as Western as it gets. That shit wouldn't fly in Pakistan. However, mass immigration into the UK is far from being without significant issues. In some sense, the British situation is one of the most problematic. Not because the integration would be least successful. Such case can be quite successfully made in the case of entirely segregated Sweden. Or because the public disorder connected to the impacts of mass immigration would be most striking. Such case can likely be made for France. But because the British political classes do not seem to have any intention of slowing things down. The net immigration into the UK has reached a record high of 750,000 people in 2022, and likely even higher figures in 2023, while many European countries, like the aforementioned Sweden and France, are somewhat successfully diminishing the immigration flows to respond to the popular demand. In this regard, the UK seems closer to its peers in the Anglosphere than to continental European countries, even though the per capita net immigration levels are even much higher in Canada or Australia. Whether we are talking about immigration or some other hotly contested topic, for example, the current situation in the Middle East, it can get pretty hard to distinguish truly objective news coverage from coverage which is blatantly politically biased. Most media outlets today do have some form of political bias. And, let's be honest here, very often it is not outright visible which is which, especially if one does not already know the source. That is where the ground news comes onto the stage. Ground news was created by a former NASA engineer to empower readers to navigate our complex media landscape, which can really feel like rocket science sometimes. It gathers related articles from around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story, and it provides you with context about the source of the information, their political bias, how reliable their reporting practices are, and who owns them, according to ratings from free, independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News offers several very cool features. You can even filter articles by political bias to see how the narrative changes. I really think they help me understand highly polarizing issues better, like what we've seen happen with this war. So, go to ground.news/Kaiserbauch to give it a try. If you sign up through my link, you'll get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is what I use to get unlimited access to all features. I think Ground News is doing important work and I hope you'll check them out. The British Isles were the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution and the demographic transition. Researchers are not entirely sure what came first and what caused what. If the scientific and industrial progress caused the rapid decline of mortality rate, or if the rapid population surge was one of the primary factors enabling the continuous scientific and industrial breakthrough. In the end, it doesn't really matter. It is the chicken or the egg situation. Whatever it was, it is not an overstatement that Britain created the modern world we all live in. And it was the concurrence of these two factors that allowed the model to perpetuate itself. Without the rise of industry, the rapidly growing population would not be able to sustain itself. In compliance with the Malthusian population theory, something that many people claim is wholly fabricated, but which, in my opinion, definitely contains certain truths, population growth inevitably clashes with the ability of the land to produce enough food to feed the people. But an industrial country, even before the scientific revolution supercharged agricultural productivity, could suddenly export industrial goods to the world and comfortably purchase agricultural products on the world markets. The invention of railroads and steamships meant that these food products could be efficiently transported to the customers. Without the rapidly growing population, the expansion of the industry would be severely limited. This rapid population growth was connected with two other revolutionary demographic changes: rapid urbanization and significant increase in life expectancy. While the cities had a less healthy environment than the villages throughout the 19th century, and the infant mortality rate was higher there in the Victorian era, they were still rapidly improving. Cheaper and more affordable clothing, as well as sewer systems, were some of the new amenities of the times that contributed to a significant decrease in the prevalence of plague as well as cholera. When you look around the world at the countries that have undergone or are undergoing massive economic development, China in the past 30 years or Vietnam today, they still are basically copying the processes that Britain had kickstarted 200 years ago. Industrialization, urbanization, and increasing lifespan. In the case of Britain, the technological progress favoring population growth synergized with convenient cultural trends in the Victorian era. The average age of marriage declined, and the number of children per woman, whether they survived or not, actually increased from 4 to 6. During the 19th century, the population of Britain thus nearly quadrupled, and that was the case even though the country experienced mass emigration throughout the period. This massive emigration out of the British Isles caused yet another permanent and massive demographic change that massively shaped the following centuries. The population of North America, Australia, New Zealand, and to a lesser extent South Africa by Europeans and specifically by Anglo-Saxons that provided these territories with their defining and lasting ethnocultural character. Anglo-American culture has been the closest thing to some form of global world culture in the history of the planet. Britain itself became the preeminent world imperial power, since its population was simultaneously growing and becoming wealthier, and all of its imperial offshoots are remarkably successful. In this regard, the contrast between the Spanish and British American colonies is very telling. Since Britain experienced a massive population explosion, it had population surpluses it could export to the colonies, and actually people them by millions. It is estimated that between 1600 and 1914, approximately 12 million Brits emigrated to the colonies. Spain's demographic and political situation during its imperial golden age did not allow it to export sufficient numbers to reach the same demographic impact. It is estimated that between 1500 and 1950, around 5 million Spaniards emigrated to Latin America, but a significant majority of them, around 3.5 million, in the post-independence era after 1850. Together with its people, Britain, and specifically England, also exported its anthropological family type, which is highly specific. No nation in history has done more for the expansion of rights and freedoms of the individual than the English. One of the hypotheses of why that is the case has to do with the work of French anthropologist Emmanuel Todd. People who follow my channel regularly likely already know what I am talking about, but for the newcomers, I will outline the basic framework of his theory. Emmanuel Todd claims that different societies worldwide had different traditional family systems in the pre-modern era, essentially in the centuries in which the majority majority of the population lived in rural dwellings and was illiterate. When the combination of spreading literacy and rising urbanization started to make the rural masses politically conscious, they subconsciously projected the archetypes experienced in their childhood within their family circle into the political ideologies they adhered to. What you experienced in your childhood greatly influences what you generally perceive as just and fair in other walks of life. The family types differ in the authority of the father figure over his offspring, in the way inheritance should be divided between the children, and also in the number of family units that live together within one household. The historical English family type was the so-called absolute nuclear family. Under this family model, the father's authority over his offspring is weak and does not continue into adulthood. The children move away from their parents soon after reaching adulthood and form their own autonomous family units. Compared to other family systems, there is minimal emphasis on the relationships between siblings, and the taboo on marriage between cousins is absolute. There were no firm cultural rules on how the inheritance should be divided between the siblings, and this matter was mostly left to the parents' will. They could divide it equally if they wanted to, but they could also leave it all to their chosen offspring. That predisposed the English towards several fundamental traits. First is a natural defiance towards the overwhelming authority of the state over its citizens, given by the weak authority of the father over his children in adulthood. The second is a propensity towards individualism, given by the fact that the individual person was not bound by the complex system of family relations that is common in other family systems. It is broadly accepted in sociology and anthropology that the level of individualism within society is very much influenced by what can be called the density of the family system. In societies with very dense clan families, where the sons traditionally all lived with their families in one household, with their father acting as a family patriarch, and where the practice of cousin marriages aimed at concentration of family property within the bloodline was common, the level of societal individualism is usually very low. People operate first and foremost as members of their extended family, or, in other words, clan. This family type is most prevalent in the Muslim world, and, in different variation, without the practice of cousin marriages in Russia or China. The English family type stands on the opposite side of the spectrum. The family ties are diminished, and a person's individualism is thus heightened. The last crucial aspect, the lack of firm cultural rules on how the inheritance should be divided between the children, predisposes societies with this traditional family type towards a larger tolerance of economic inequality. Suppose one understands from an early age that inequality is just a natural component of life on the family level. In that case, he does not expect economic equality to be enforced by the state. Britain is a notoriously classist society, after all. The political implications of these anthropological traits on the societal level are clear. Societies with an absolute nuclear family naturally ideologically tend towards liberalism, meant in the original meaning of the word, as an ideology combining economic and political freedoms, and are incapable of producing homegrown totalitarian regimes, which seek to achieve complete absorption of the civil society by the state. While there was a brief period of dictatorship in modern English history under Oliver Cromwell, it was temporary and respected private property. The independent activity of an individual within the society was respected. The economic power of the state actually diminished during the English Revolution, and from the 18th century onwards, the constitutional monarchy was established and remained relatively stable. The main strongholds of economic and political liberalism in the 19th century and the neoliberal revival gaining strength from the 1980s onwards always resided in the Anglo-American world. And the Anglo-American world has been remarkably successful in this regard. All the Anglo-Saxon colonial offshoots are among the most economically successful states on the planet. Demographically, the combined countries on the Anglosphere have 475 million inhabitants and are growing, while the European Union has less than 450 million, and the difference between them will only increase. From a relatively marginal island off the coast of Europe, with a population 1/4 of France throughout most of the Middle Ages, the Anglo world has exploded to now become the heart of the Western civilization and its most important power and cultural center of gravity, especially in the form of the United States. The contribution of England to modern popular culture has obviously been absolutely massive as well. The individualistic dynamism of English speakers has driven driven the history of the world since the English political revolutions of the 17th century. Emmanuel Todd argues that one of the strengths of the absolute nuclear family in the modern period is that it required the least amount of drastic changes to somehow adapt to the modern, urbanized, industrialized world. The absolute nuclear family, an autonomous unit of parents and their children, has become the standard throughout every part of the world that has undergone at least some fundamental level of economic development. But for most societies, this process has been very painful. The dismantling of traditional social patterns has caused massive upheavals throughout the world, and the process of industrialization has often led to huge ideological confusion and various types of political responses, causing hundreds of millions to perish in the process. Whether the totalitarian dictatorships of Nazism and communism in the 20th century, waves of Muslim fundamentalism in more recent times, or the ultra-low fertility under one child per woman experienced by certain East Asian societies today, all are, to a certain degree, reactions of various social structures to their dismantling by modernity. The transition has been much less painful for the Anglo world, since the English peasant has lived in the absolute nuclear family for centuries, even though the material conditions have obviously changed dramatically. Even the fertility crash has been significantly less severe in the English-speaking world, where the fertility rates historically never dropped to the ultra-low levels close to one child per woman, observable in southern, central and eastern Europe or East Asia. If we look at the population pyramid of the white British population in the UK, it is much healthier than what can one observe in the aforementioned countries, even though it is also impacted by population aging. The position of women in absolute nuclear family societies has historically been relatively egalitarian, which allowed for better adaptation to the modern wave of female emancipation from the 1960s onwards. One of the common catchphrases that one can often see floating around in the British immigration debate is the claim that Britain has always been a country of immigrants. Unless one wants to go for some kind of ultra macro historical view going back thousands of years, under which every country on the planet is historically a country of immigrants, that is just a blatant lie. The only immigration in the somewhat recent history of Britain that comes close to the current levels in terms of relative demographic impact is the Irish immigration of the 19th and early 20th centuries, which especially affected Glasgow. The first massive wave of immigration from culturally more distant source countries came after 1948. There was a period that lasted until 1962, when Commonwealth citizens could automatically enter Britain. A number of workers from British colonies in the Caribbean and an Indian subcontinent arrived. Around 500,000 only in the 1955 to 1962 period. The initial waves of immigrants after World War II were quite successfully integrated. As I often repeat, immigration from various sources can be handled without issues. It is mostly a question of pace and scale, which was fairly limited in the case of Britain after the war. Nevertheless, there still was a very considerable and harsh backlash against the black migrants. From this era is also the famous Rivers of Blood speech by the Conservative PM Enoch Powell. In the speech, Enoch Powell says, among other things, quote, "Here is a decent, ordinary fellow Englishman who in broad daylight in my own town says to me, his member of parliament, that the country will not be worth living in for his children. I simply do not have the right to shrug my shoulders and think about something else. What he is saying, thousands and hundreds of thousands are saying and thinking, not throughout Great Britain perhaps, but in the areas that are already undergoing the total transformation to which there is no parallel in thousands of years of English history. We must be mad, literally mad, as a nation to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents, who are for the most part the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre." End of quote. The speech is properly controversial and was smeared as racist by many politicians as well as the press. Enoch Powell was removed from his shadow cabinet position. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of the communities most affected by immigration in London or Wolverhampton wrote tens of thousands of letters of support to Powell and also went on strike to support him. According to a national survey, 74% of the population agreed with Powell, while just 15% opposed him. At the time, 2% of the British population was non-white, and many people in Britain had never seen a black person. For the next 30 years, immigration was not that big of a deal in Britain, since the net immigration levels were relatively modest. Around 50 to 70,000 people annually, and the immigration policy was very restrictive. Margaret Thatcher, in a very similar fashion to Charles de Gaulle in France 2 decades earlier, seemed to look at immigration as a culturally enriching phenomenon, as long as the communities were just a small minority. Until the 1990s, Britain followed a very different path than the other Anglosphere countries. In North America or Australasia, there were very restrictive, ethnically demarcated immigration quotas up until the 1960s, when the Cultural Revolution swept over the nations and ensured much more relaxed and ethnically non-restrictive immigration policies. In Britain, the opposite happened. The immigration policy was extremely liberal from 1948 to 1962, due to the possibility of free entrance to Britain by the citizens of the Commonwealth. And then it became much more restrictive from the 1960s onwards. The point of convergence came in the 1990s, with the premiership of Tony Blair and his so-called New Labour. The mix of social and economic liberalism, free trade, and very relaxed immigration policies defined Blair's government. The elites definitively started to abandon the ethnically exclusive view of the English or British people as an ethnoculturally clearly defined group that could be enriched by small immigration communities, but should nevertheless remain an overwhelming majority, and started to adopt the more vague conception of the British nation as defined by Blair's government secretary Robin Cook. Quote, "The British are not a race, but a gathering of countless different races and communities, the vast majority of which were not indigenous to these islands." End of quote. The chicken masala symbolized modern Britain, since it represented the desired cultural fusion. Cook sought to deconstruct the idea of ethnic homogeneity by stressing the Celtic, Norman, and Norse invaders of the past centuries, and also the fact that over 300 languages are regularly spoken in London, all the very well-known stuff. Diversity just became the main British strength in the eyes of many of the elites. The immigration gradually started to rise, to levels around 200,000 net annual immigration. London has become one of the centres of newly emerging global cosmopolitan capitalism. A significant proportion of British elites adopted missionary liberal nationalism as a cornerstone of their national identity, a strain of thinking where one's identity is not based on the shared ethnocultural ethos, but on the opinions of similarly tuned elites elsewhere. The majority of Brits, however, never shared this particular way of defining their identity. Essentially, it is a conflict between the somewheres and anywheres, two groups defined by David Goodhart. Anywheres are the people that define themselves much more by their personally achieved status, such as an educational level or a profession, than by any inherently common characteristics, such as nationality. The creative, college-educated classes living in metropolitan areas that could, however, easily exchange London for Sydney, New York, or Dubai if they wanted to. They often feel more connection to other like-minded people around the world than to working-class people from their own country. The so-called somewheres are the people whose identity is much more bound by the locally shared ascribed characteristics, such as shared history, common appearance, religion, language, or nationality. They are much less likely to have a college education. In sociological surveys, only 36% of people who say that their education means a lot for their identity simultaneously consider their nation very important for who they are. College education is the most important predictor of one's values in contemporary Britain, much more so than money. That was very well reflected in the Brexit vote. While 68% of remaining voters said that English diverse cultural life strongly contributed to their English identity, only 38% of Leave voters shared this approach. When asked what should be a higher priority for the government, whether promoting British culture or welcoming different cultures in Britain, people who voted to leave the EU heavily favoured the former, while the remainers favoured the latter. Different variations of this cleavage drive politics throughout many Western countries. After the enlargement of the EU in 2004, the UK was one of the few countries that allowed unrestricted movement of the citizens of the newly accepted countries, which resulted in new mass migration waves from post-communist Europe to the UK. Throughout the 2000s, the EU and non-EU migration were both continuously substantial, but the non-EU migration was almost always somewhat higher. After the 2016 Brexit referendum, and especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, EU immigration reduced drastically to become net emigration. In the past couple of years, the immigration levels reached record highs, being overwhelmingly legal and non-European. The result is clear and predictable: massive ethnic change in a remarkably slow period of time. The UK is likely the only European country collecting demographic statistics based on ethnicity or race, which connects Britain with the rest of the Anglosphere, so the numbers are very exact. In 1991, the population of the United Kingdom was 94.5% white. The category white British did not exist back then, since there weren't many reasons to include it. It can be reasonably assumed that the overwhelming majority of the white people category were white British people. Between 1991 and 2001, the decade in which Blair's New Labour relaxed the immigration legislation, the white British category declined to 89.7%, so still a relatively modest decline. But in the 2000s, the change really gained pace. White British ethnicity comprised 82.8% of the population in 2011 and 75.5% of the population in 2021. That is a decline of between 6 and 7% within a decade. The vast majority of this decline is caused by continuous mass immigration, and partially also by the fertility advantage of the newcomers, since the number of white British people has, in absolute numbers, declined only relatively modestly, from less than 53 million people in 2001 to little over 50 million in 2021. That contrasts with the example of Germany, where the number of ethnic Germans without immigration background might have declined by almost 15 million in the past 50 years, due to the persistently low German fertility. Moreover, you can clearly see the impacts of Brexit, since between 2011 and 2021, the white other category, under which all non-British Europeans belong, declined from 4.3 to 2.3% of the population, or from 2.7 to 1.5 million people. That is quite ironic for the following reason. A significant part of the British public has been dissatisfied with the immigration levels and the ongoing ethnic change for quite some time now, at least for 2 decades. The Conservative Party has promised a reduction of immigration to the pre-Tony Blair levels, so in tens rather than in hundreds of thousands annually, since at least 2010. The way in which the Tories managed to continuously promise to substantially lower the immigration, only for immigration to gradually increase, is almost impressive in a way. However, throughout the whole period, politicians were significantly more willing to attack Eastern European immigration than non-European immigration, and that remains the fact, even though a deep dive into sociological surveys done by Eric Kaufman shows that non-European immigration was always a more pressing issue for Brits than the EU immigration. However, criticizing non-European immigration was always very risky due to the anti-racist taboo. The European Union, with its free movement of labor and the millions of Poles, Romanians, Lithuanians and such, has become somewhat of a punching bag, representing the overall dissatisfaction with immigration. That does not by any means mean that people would not have legitimate reasons to oppose immigration from Eastern Europe. I support the right of any nation to decide who they will share their country with. If Brits do not want millions of people from post-communist Europe in their country, it is their sovereign right. And I am sure that many Brits do have negative experiences with Eastern Europeans. I have several friends who have worked in the UK or the Netherlands in warehouses or similar jobs, and the types of people from Eastern Europe you can meet there definitely can be very sketchy. They also drove the wages down, precisely in the fields occupied by white working class Brits, but it always seems suspicious to me when people claimed that Brits are completely okay with millions of people from Pakistan, Nigeria or Bangladesh, while being fired up by Poles and Slovaks. As Eric Kaufman claims in his book White Shift, criticism of excessive numbers of South Asians or Africans coming into the UK could very easily lead to one being branded as racist. However, since Eastern Europeans are white, they are not protected by the anti-racist taboo. This phenomenon, the projection of overall immigration discontent into the Brexit vote, even though it concerned only less than half of overall immigration, likely contributed to the UK leaving the European Union. That consequently contributed to more than 1 million people falling under the white other category, the majority of them likely Eastern Europeans, leaving the United Kingdom. Although non-European immigration into the UK did not diminish in the slightest, the share of people of European origin has declined significantly more rapidly than it would without Brexit. But probably even more revolutionary change than in the UK as a whole has happened in its most important cities, especially London. Now, London is not just any other city. It is one of the defining cities in modern world history. It was the world's largest city in the 19th century and still is usually considered one of the world's 2 most important economic, financial and cultural centers, together with New York. Most London boroughs have produced more world-renowned musicians than the vast majority of countries on the planet. The decline of London's white British population is absolutely striking. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, London was an overwhelming overwhelmingly white British city, around 90%. The decline has occurred since the 1980s and reached massive proportions in the past few decades. Between 2001 and 2011, the white British population of London proportionally declined by 15%. Between 2011 and 2021, by another 9%. What is fascinating is that this decline is obviously too steep to be explained by pure immigration influx. The white Brits have been leaving London in staggering numbers. In 1970, 6.5 million white Brits lived in London. In 2021, it was 3.2 million, or 37% of the city's population. Now, this is more of a cultural observation than something data-based, but when one watches British movies from London made in the late 1990s or early 2000s, one can feel that the city on the screen does not exist anymore. For example, the gangster movies by Guy Ritchie, like Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels from 1998 and Snatch from 2000. London in those pictures is full of various ethnically English, possibly Irish or Scottish, lowlifes, criminals and scoundrels with heavy accents trying to scrape by. Or the Green Street Hooligans from 2005, which is not that great of a movie, but I still enjoyed it a lot when I was younger. It shows you a reality of London in which the biggest cause of public unrest is a bunch of white English football fans with heavy accents beating the shit out of each other on the streets. That is hardly the most pressing issue today. Those movies are fiction, but they still possess some observational cultural value. There is an interesting BBC documentary called The Last Whites of the East End from 2016, which follows the remaining white working class families in an area that becomes ultra diverse, and most of their peers decided to leave. And there are many other British cities where white British people are now a minority. They comprise 33% of the population in Birmingham, 49% in Manchester, 33% in Leicester, 24% in Slough, and 32% in Luton. White British school pupils comprise 66% of all pupils in the UK as a whole, but only 23% of all school pupils in Greater London, 27% of school pupils in Birmingham, 23% in Leicester, and 12% in Slough. That is quite something. In terms of live births, 58% of live births in England and Wales were of white British ethnicity in 2019, while 70% of live births were white if other people of European heritage were included. Now, if there are so few white British people in these cities, who actually lives there? In the UK as a whole, South Asians are by far the most populous migrant group. Indians, Pakistanis and Bangladeshis comprise over 6% of the UK population. After that, people of various African backgrounds are the most populous group, comprising 3.7% of the population. In Leicester, Indians comprise 34% of the population. In Birmingham, Pakistanis comprise 17% of the population. In Slough, Indians and Pakistanis comprise almost half of the population. So, the distribution of the minorities within the country is massively unequal. They are hyperlocal. They are overwhelmingly concentrated in England. And within England, they are heavily concentrated in several metropolitan areas. Almost 36% of all people of South Asian ethnicity live only in London and Birmingham. There are still many large cities in the UK that are relatively overwhelmingly white British. Leeds, Liverpool, Sheffield, Bristol or Newcastle are all major English cities where the share of minorities is in sync with the national average. The reason for this development, the ultra-local concentration of certain ethnic groups, is that white Britons have increasingly self-segregated in the past 20 years. The good old white flight has been happening on quite a significant scale in the UK. When the share of the minorities increased, the whites started to leave or ceased moving into the area. More specifically, it could be called white avoidance, since white British people choosing not to move to diverse neighborhoods plays an even larger role than them leaving. 44% of non-whites in Britain are concentrated in just 6% of the wards, where whites are a minority. On the contrary, just 4% of white Brits live in those wards, and almost 80% of wards in England and Wales remain more than 90% white. The white flight is especially pronounced for white British families. While many young white British people are entering London to get jobs in the vibrant economy of the capital city, after some time, they are leaving to start families elsewhere. That means the segregation among school pupils is even more dramatic than among the general population. Some of it is just a well-known suburbanization process happening everywhere, but the non-white population is engaging in it much less, even if economic factors are controlled for. Non-whites in the UK are not interested in moving to heavily white neighborhoods, while white Brits prefer exactly that. The political opinions of people hardly hardly matter. Conservative and liberal white Britons behave more or less the same in this regard. One can be as persuaded as possible that the diversity is the greatest strength of Britain, but he is still likely to move and start a family in an overwhelmingly white British neighborhood. Britain is largely divided between what has been in an American context dubbed two nations, metro and retro. Metro is the vast, hyper-diverse, progressive metropolitan areas, typically London, where the college-educated elites of the globalized knowledge economy, the anywheres, the investment bankers, startup owners, graphic designers, architects, college professors and such, live side by side with vast economic underclasses of immigration background that are needed to man the gig economy servicing the ultra-wealthy. And then there is the retro nation, the aging, more conservative and demographically native smaller towns, suburbs and rural areas, where many of the natives from the cities escape. The politics of many Western nations revolve around a conflict between these two elements. The ethnic makeup of the United Kingdom has been permanently changed. That is just a fact. The potential future scenarios in Britain are thus likely similar to those elsewhere in Europe. The first opinion is some form of ethnic rehomogenization, in which minorities are forced to leave or leave voluntarily by millions. I do not believe this will happen. That there will be some massive remigration process causing significant demographic changes and making the population once again more native. There might be harsher immigration laws, and there might be deportations of illegals or bad apples among the immigrants, but that won't fundamentally change the fact that 30% of new births in England are non-white. Even if immigration would halt immediately, that in itself guarantees that the United Kingdom, a couple of decades from now, will be more diverse than it is today. The second option is what Eric Kaufmann calls a salad bowl, in which the whites remain unmixed and do not intermarry, and the societies remained ethnically largely segregated. In this scenario, white Britons would be declining as a proportion of the population, due to their subreplacement fertility rates and older age structure. However, if immigration was completely shut off, something that is highly unlikely but cannot be completely ruled out, the native population would stay a majority, since the fertility advantage of the immigrant groups tend to converge during a generation or two. If immigration continues similarly as it has for the past 30 years, whites would remain homogeneous, but a steeply declining ethnic group in this scenario, akin to whites in South Africa. And there is always the possibility of fertility rates rising for some reason in the future, which would again change the calculation. In the most extreme version of the segregation scenario, certain people suggest the creation of new white ethnostates carved out of the traditional European countries. That is almost ruled out. The geographic distribution of the migrant populations mostly prohibits it. The most diverse parts of every country are the largest metropolitan area, which simultaneously serve as economic engines with huge mythological value for the national identities of various nations. The third option is fusion through marriage, in which the native white population slowly merges with the non-whites and some new cultural entity is thus created. All things considered, that is the most likely option. Western European populations do not have any strong cultural taboos regarding intermarriage in place. There are quite significant differences in intermarriage rates throughout Western Europe, with the general rule of thumb being that the egalitarian authoritarian family type prevalent in Germanic Europe usually brings relatively very low levels of intermarriage, and the salad bowl option is thus quite likely there, while the egalitarian universalist family type prevalent in France brings comparatively very high intermarriage levels, even between natives and Muslims. The United Kingdom is somewhere in between. The mixed race or mixed ethnicity population is growing very fast in the UK, with the white and black Caribbean coupling being the most common combination, followed by the white and Asian combination and the white and black African combination. While mixed-race Brits comprise only 2.6% of the population so far, they comprise 6% of school pupils and 6.5% of live births in England and Wales. They will almost certainly be the fastest growing group going into the future, since as the very diverse youngest cohorts of Brits grow older, there will be a higher chance of intermarriage purely mathematically, due to the distribution of possible partners. Moreover, the mixed-race category tends to grow exponentially in time, since mixed-race individuals always produce mixed-race offsprings. But not all groups in the UK intermarry to the same degree. The data reveals that the black Caribbean population and black Africans do intermarry in relatively high numbers. The Asian category is tricky, since it does not differentiate between different nationalities, but the data data on religion suggest that there is a low level of outmarriage among the largest Asian groups in Britain. 75% of mixed-race individuals coming from white Asian couples were either Christian or irreligious, while only 13% were Muslim or Hindu. Groups from societies with clannish family types, based on the practice of pre-arranged cousin marriages, typically Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, are notoriously low in intermarriage rates throughout Western Europe. UK Indians are similarly low, mostly due to cultural taboos. Most of the white Asian intermixed people are likely of East Asian background. Since these groups, the South Asians, are the most populous minorities in the UK, and since they very often live in segregated ethnic neighborhoods, it obviously poses a challenge. The future will tell if British society manages to overcome this hurdle, or if segregation on ethno-religious basis between the Muslim South Asians and the rest just becomes a permanent feature of British public life, causing continuous friction. Immigration is currently one of the most lively political topics in the UK. Unfortunately, from outsiders' perspective, it seems highly unlikely that something will change in the coming years, since if Conservatives were unwilling or unable to curb immigration, the most likely next Labour government will hardly be better. The current immigration levels are truly gigantic and will make any progress regarding the successful integration of foreigners very difficult, since the continuous inflow of people overwhelms the capacities of the state and contributes to minorities being surrounded by their co-ethnics. Similar to Canada, the vast majority of mass immigration in the last couple of years has been legal, and a significant portion was based on student visa. That should not be that hard to curb if there is a political will. In the past, England and its offshoots hugely contributed to the creation of the modern world. Today, the same countries are on the frontier of new revolutions in the Western world, with massive ethnic changes due to continuous immigration. The decline of white majorities in Canada, Australia and New Zealand seems pretty much guaranteed at this point. The fate of the United Kingdom is less certain. While it can be successfully argued that the Anglosphere offshoots were created by colonization and immigration, and it's part of their DNA. While having clear Anglo-Saxon roots, many other European and consequently non-European immigrants were later incorporated into the mainstream national identities of these countries. Britain is different though. Britain was not created by immigration in the past 250 years. It is the native land of its people. In regards to immigration attitudes, same as in many other social topics, the UK is somewhere in the middle, between the Anglosphere and continental Europe. It is part of Europe, but also an island of its coast, which has always defined its attitudes. Similar, but different. We will see what the future brings for the British.